I'm the manager for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. We'd like to welcome you to the Safety Center's July webinar entitled Rural Roundabouts or Saving Lives. I'm going to go ahead and close out all of our polls and give you guys a little bit of information about them. It does look like we have a good distribution across the U.S. today. We have about 12% from the Northeast, 25% from the Southeast, 23% for the Midwest, and about 26% from Western. And then we have about 12% from others as well. It does look like the good majority of you are joining us by yourself, but there are quite a few of you actually in groups and conference rooms. So as always, I would ask if you could please send us a detailed list of names and emails to info@ruralsafetycenter.org so that we can make sure you receive the survey, which is the only way that you can request certificates and CEUs for today's webinar. It also looks like we have the majority of you, about 37 or 33% of you are from state DOTs today. We also have about 30% from private consultants, 10% from other federal, state, or local agencies, 14% from local transportation departments, and about 4% from federal transportation departments. It also looks like about 73% of you are joining us by computer only, and about 27% from both. If you are joining us from computer only, I will remind you that if you do have any audio issues, if you could please dial in via the phone. The phone number can be found in the top left-hand corner of your screen. And I will move us over to our presentation at this point. Okay, so just a few webinar logistics for you. Today's webinar will be an hour and a half long. It is being recorded and will be available on our website. So for quality of the recording, all of your phone lines have been muted with exception of the presenter and another FHWA staff member who will be helping to answer questions. If you are listening by the phone, we would ask that you please mute your computers, otherwise you will have some feedback. To maximize the presentation, you will see 4 arrows that press outward in the top right-hand corner of your screen. That will make the screen a little bit bigger for some of the graphics that will be shown later. At the end of each section, which there will be 3 of today, there will be time for question and answer. You can put any of those questions into our chat pod over on the left-hand side, and I will read those out to our presenter at the time when we stop. There's also a handout pod in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. That provides you with a PDF of today's presentation slides, as well as a PDF of our Save the Date card for our second summit, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and also a PDF of our sponsor packet if you are interested in helping to sponsor that presentation or that summit as well. As I mentioned, please make sure you send the group list to info@ruralsafetycenter.org, and please complete our follow-up surveys. They are vital to assessing our webinar quality. There will be 2 of them. You'll receive one directly following today's presentation, and the next one will come out about 3 months later. The one in 3 months is a 4-question survey, and we're just trying to figure out what you did with the information that you learned in today's webinar, whether or not perhaps you passed it on to a colleague, if you had provided them with the archived version of this to listen to it as well, if perhaps you have tried to go out and start planning for a roundabout or looked into more resources afterwards. The survey link can now be found on your screen. We will, as I mentioned, send that out again directly following today's webinar, but sometimes those emails do show up in your junk folder. This survey will close 2 weeks after the webinar, and you could expect any certificates or CEU forms that you do request about 3 to 4 weeks after the webinar. We do need to wait until it closes in order to get the list of who has asked for those. There will be a CEU form also attached to that email, and it can be sent back to continuinged@montana.edu and not to the Safety Center. That is run out of a different program at Montana State University. There's also a verification of completion form that you can request once you have requested several CEUs from us, and I'll show you what that looks like. On the top left of this screen currently, you can see the course registration form. That is what you will fill out and provide back to Continuing Ed at Montana State. And on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is what a verification would look like. This would be how you would show to the licensure board that you have indeed received these CEUs. At this time, I know last time we mentioned that we were a little bit behind on our CEUs because we were waiting for those forms. We have provided certificates for all of the webinars up through June. The remainder of June's webinar certificates will go out later this afternoon. So if you have not received any that you have requested, please do contact us. And Dana, it looks like we may be having some issues with our slides. Could you please take a look? Thank you very much.
Okay, there you go.
Perfect, thank you. Today's presenter will be Hillary Isebrands. She is from the FHWA Resource Center and is a Safety and Design Technical Service Team and Roadway Safety Engineer. Hillary has contributed to the transportation profession for over 20 years. She has expertise as a roadway design and safety engineer as well as a traffic engineer and transportation researcher. Hillary is currently the Senior Roadway Safety Engineer and Team Leader with FHWA Resource Center Safety Design. As part of the 16-person national team, she provides safety and design technical assistance, deploys current design and safety technologies, and provides project reviews to FHWA's internal and external customers. She specializes in roundabouts and local and rural road safety and design. Hillary also oversees the National Center for Rural Road Safety, a MAP 21 Center of Excellence. Prior to working with FHWA, Hillary conducted research at Iowa State University's Center for Transportation Research and Education. She performed research in the areas of rural roundabouts and intersections, as well as pedestrian and traffic safety. Additionally, she served as a technical advisor to the Iowa DOT on roundabouts and facilitated and conducted roundabout educational presentations and seminars for the public and local government agencies. Earlier in her career, Hillary was a project manager and transportation engineer for an engineering consulting firm in Wisconsin. She is a professional engineer in Iowa and Wisconsin, a National Highway Institute certified instructor, and has her bachelor's, master's, and PhD in civil engineering. Hillary is a member and secretary of the TRB Standing Committee on Roundabouts, a past member of the TRB Standing Committee on Geometric Design, and the past chair of the ITE Roundabout Task Force. So we're very happy today to have Hillary with us to talk about roundabouts. And once you have completed this webinar, you will have an overview of the safety and design of rural roundabouts in the United States, including case studies of rural roundabouts on local and state highways, as well as the safety experience. To achieve this webinar goal, you will learn how to state the risks of rural intersections, to summarize the benefits of roundabouts on rural roadways, to name examples of rural roundabouts in the U.S., and to list some of the characteristics of rural roundabouts with high-speed approaches. And before we get started today, we did have one poll question that we wanted to check in with everyone on, and that is, did you attend our Rural Intersection Safety and Countermeasures webinar that was held on June 14th? Okay, and it looks like everyone has been able to fill out that poll question. It looks like, Hillary, we have about 25% of the people that have joined us today that did also join us for June 14th. And at this time, I am going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Hillary.
All right, Jamie, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to the group today. And for those of you who might have encountered me before, you know that I really do enjoy talking about not only roundabouts, but specifically talking about the opportunities that we might have for rural roundabouts. And sometimes that means high-speed approaches, not always. We're going to cover a lot of ground here today in terms of looking at intersection safety in general as it relates to in the rural environment. And it looks, again, like 25% of you were able to join Mark Doctor in his presentation last month with the Rural Safety Center. So I'm not going to repeat a lot, but there will be just a couple of points that I will make as we transition into focusing on rural roundabouts. And as always, I always want as many questions as possible. I want this to be as interactive as possible in this environment. I know sometimes that can be a challenge, but please go ahead and put questions into the chat pod. Jamie has several opportunities for us to engage with each other as we move through this next 90 minutes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So defining rural roadways, that can actually, as you go across the country, rural means different things to different people. And it's important from my perspective that it makes sense to you and it makes sense to your partners what rural means to you. So what rural might be in New Jersey might not be what rural is in Texas or in California or in Montana. But the important piece is that, sometimes there are features that I'm going to talk about briefly that are consistent when we have that conversation about the rural environment, the rural roadways, and what that means to users, but what it also means in terms of opportunities to provide safe travel through those areas. Oftentimes, you can look at rural in terms of, speed, posted speed and operating speed. Diverse road users, pedestrians are using those roadways differently than they are in an urban environment. More often than not, you do not have a pedestrian infrastructure, sidewalks or pathways in a rural environment. So treating those users in a rural environment looks a little bit differently. Bicyclists tend to use shoulders and actually use the travel lane itself in rural environments. We tend to see, in particular on some routes, we've got trucking routes, we've got oversized, overweight routes. In a lot of parts of the country, farming equipment and agriculture is a critical part of the maybe the economic vitality of a particular area. Of course, wildlife, depending on where you are, wildlife, whether that's a deer or that's a moose or that's an elk, there's a lot of different things that you can encounter in the rural environment that you wouldn't always in an urban environment. And again, land use, that also ties to land use in terms of agriculture, recreation, forests, prairie lands, and just really taking that all into consideration as you're looking for opportunities to improve safety at rural intersections. So again, no matter where you are across the country and even around the world, it's really looking at what risks might be associated with the rural environment. Oftentimes, as I've mentioned, there's higher speed. Greater than 35 miles per hour is typically, and I know that number might vary depending on exactly what reference you're using and what exactly you're talking about. But we know that above 35 miles an hour, that definitely means different things in terms of how drivers might interact with a pedestrian or bicyclist. And those speed differentials at intersections, we know that intersections are planned conflict points. So whether it's stop controlled, always stop, two-way stop, signalized intersection, we know that those speed differentials have the chance of increasing the risk that you might have at a junction. At-grade intersections are obviously the most common intersections that we see in the rural environments. More often than not, we're talking about two-lane roadways. It doesn't mean we can't talk about a rural expressway or a four-lane type facility, or even a three or a five-lane facility when it comes to the when it comes to the rural context. And then oftentimes lighting is something that is not often seen in a rural environment, or the lighting might be more destination lighting. It might be a light on a power pole versus lighting that has actually been designed for an intersection or for a roadway. So those all can affect the risk in the rural environment. I obviously did not put up their traffic volume or the volumes that we have on maybe a main line or in a minor road, but those are also risks that we have to consider when we're looking at the rural environment. So just some intersection safety facts, and again, this is consistent with what Mark presented, Mark Doctor, last month when he was talking about rural intersections in general. In 2016, there were over 10,000 deaths at intersections, and nearly 7,000 of those 7,000 deaths were at unsignalized intersections. So again, just think about your agencies and the areas that you work in, and think about the percentage of unsignalized versus signalized intersection and what that might mean for you in terms of solving some of your safety issues. About 3,850 deaths were in rural areas. So again, we know that rural in general is it's a different environment, and there's different challenges. And then ultimately that means there's different solutions that we might look to address those issues. So of those 3,850 deaths in rural areas, about 85% of those deaths were on roadways with posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour or greater. Okay, so again, if you're trying to hone in or drill down to the areas that might have the highest risk and address that, whether it's from a reactive perspective or it's a proactive perspective with systemic safety, it's important to take that into account when you're looking for projects and looking for ways to improve your network. All right, sorry about that. I just got a little bit of a delay on my on moving my slides forward. But Federal Highways, for quite some time now, over a decade, has really considered roundabouts as a proven safety countermeasure. It's really hard to dispute the facts that we have related to roundabouts on our roadway network, and that not only is in the rural environment, but is in the suburban environment and an urban environment. So roundabouts can fit in all of those different environments, and they fit very well. You can see that what we're quoting there is actually from the Highway Safety Manual, two-way stop-controlled intersections to a roundabout of 82% reduction in severe crashes, signalized intersections 78%. And those statistics are consistent. Originally, 15 years ago, we had to look to our international partners and colleagues in terms of looking at those safety benefits. But we have data here in the U.S. now with the original study that was done by the Insurance Institute and some work with Federal Highways, moving on to NCHRP report 572 and the data that they found there, and then ultimately a more recent project that Federal Highways undertook in looking at some additional data, and then the very most recent NCHRP 1770, which hopefully that report will be out very soon and we can all get our hands on it, is really looking at that detailed before and after data of roundabouts. And again, the rural roundabouts really do stand out in terms of addressing and eliminating those right-angle severe crashes. So some of the roundabout facts, again, that we have from the U.S., and we continue to learn. I mean, compared to other countries around the world, we really still are in our infancy in the deployment of roundabouts, and not just in rural areas, but all across the board in all the environments. So we estimate that there are probably over 4,500 monitored roundabouts in the United States. The statistics that we continue to report and find are before and after crash data, 90% reduction in fatalities, 76% reduction in injuries, and 35% reduction in all crashes. We know that Roundabouts offer slow speeds for all vehicles, which is a good thing for not only vehicle-vehicle interaction, but also vehicle bike, vehicle ped, vehicle truck, the whole 9 yards. We know that slow vehicles means safer, typically a safer environment. Those reduced conflict points, you can see the images on the right. We've used those for years in terms of looking at the difference between the conflict points of a traditional four-way intersection and that same intersection as a roundabout, going from 32 conflict points to 8 conflict points. Again, the diameter for rural roundabouts, it's fair to say now in the U.S. we actually have, in general, actually this isn't specific to rural roundabouts, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but we do have roundabouts that range from 45 feet in diameter to 300 feet in diameter across the country now. And so that means single-lane compact roundabouts, and that means up to 3-lane roundabouts, and even 5- and 6-leg roundabouts that we have in the country. More specifically, looking at rural roundabouts. Sorry guys, I've got a bit of a delay here on my screen. Jamie, is it possible for you to advance the next slide? I don't seem to be getting anywhere with my advancement.
Yes, absolutely. You wanted to be on the slide with all the pictures.
The rural
correct?
roundabout by the
Yep.
numbers? Okay, thank you. Is it up, Jamie?
So the one with the graph or the one with the 6 pictures?
Actually, the one before that. It's rural roundabouts by the numbers, so the one before the 6 pictures.
Perfect. Okay. Yep,
Okay.
it is there now.
So I don't seem to be advancing for some reason, so I'll just work with you, and I've got the hard copy in front of me, and we'll just keep moving along.
Perfect.
So, so again, specific to rural roundabouts, we probably estimate, or I estimate, I won't blame anyone else, I'll blame myself. I estimate that there's well over probably 200 roundabouts in very rural environments, roundabouts in isolation. We, of course, do have some rural roundabouts that might be at interchange ramp terminals and some others that might kind of be in that fringe or suburban area. But it's fair enough to say that, back in the early 2000s, we probably had only 20 roundabouts that were isolated in a very rural environment. And now here we are 18 years later, and we have well over 200 in the rural environment. Again, that's my estimate based on what I have seen across the country here in the U.S. The posted speed limits on the approaches to these rural roundabouts range from 35 miles an hour to 65 miles per hour. And so, again, you can see that is an important element in terms of the design of the roundabout from a geometric standpoint, but then also all the other elements that we'll get to a little bit later. The before and after statistics for roundabouts in rural environments, again, we've got about 88% reduction in injury crashes and about a 68% reduction in all crashes. So you do see a little bit more in terms of reduction in all crashes in the rural environment. Sometimes that does have to do with the fact that they are single lane. So there's a less conflicts that you might see in an urban environment where you've got multi-lanes. And then it also has to do with the traffic volume. But again, when you isolate rural roundabouts, you do see a slightly different statistics in terms of the before and after data that we have. The diameter ranges that we see in the rural environment range from 90 feet in diameter to just over 200 feet in diameter. And again, it depends on how many legs you have and the exact context of your project. And so, Jamie, can you advance it to the images? So the images that you should all be seeing now, there's a few of them there from across the country. We've got Washington and Oregon. We've got something from Maryland and Kansas. So these were some of the original rural roundabouts in the country. And they all look slightly different depending on, in terms of that definition of rural in these environments. But you can see hopefully that for the most part they are primarily isolated. So drivers have been driving for quite some time before they get to these intersections. And so it's important that we give the right information to drivers as they navigate through those intersections. Jamie, go ahead and advance to the next slide. And the next slide has a couple of images there. We've got a sample of crash data from rural roundabouts. So this is some of the original 17 rural roundabouts in isolation with high-speed approaches in the U.S. So you can see there that before the roundabout was put in, we've got two-way stop control intersections. There was, in this before and after study, there was 12 fatal crashes at those 17 locations. And then after the roundabouts were put in, there were 0 fatalities. And that still stands actually based on the knowledge that I have from the states and the locations of those 17 locations. There still has not been fatalities at those locations. You can also look at the injury data there, again with the red being in the before condition and the yellow being in the after condition. So you'll notice that the property damage only crashes, there was a couple of, I would call them outlier locations that did have some additional PDO crashes. But again, the value and the benefit related to the injury crashes was significant. The next slide there looks a little bit deeper into the types of crashes that were occurring at those roundabouts. Again, you can see the significant reduction in the angle crashes. So we know those angle crashes are the ones that have the most severe type of crashes, the injury crashes, the fatal crashes, the significant reduction in angle crashes. You also might pick out from that graph that there actually was an increase in fixed object crashes in the after condition. And that was kind of a mystery when we first looked at that. And that continues to stand from almost 15 years ago when we looked at some of the original rural roundabouts to the rural roundabouts that we look at today, is we do see that there are run off the road crashes where folks are hitting either a sign or a curb. So in many cases, the curbing was considered a fixed object in those rural environments. But again, the results are the same in the fact that we've got almost, at least in this case study or this sample size, completely eliminating the fatal crashes, significantly reducing the injury crashes at those locations. And again, with the 68% reduction in total crashes, that is also an important element to consider. Jamie, if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see something that was recently published by the Connecticut Department of Transportation, where their original, their first, I would say, roundabouts in that state. Now, this is a mix of fringe roundabouts, at least one rural roundabout and some more suburban roundabouts. But they're actually, I like the way that Connecticut has presented this information to us. And they are saying they got with those first 5 intersections, those first 5 that were converted to roundabouts, an 81% reduction in severe crashes and a 49% reduction in overall crashes. And as of 2017, 150 crashes and 100 injuries have been prevented. That's the estimate that the Connecticut DOT has made based on the installation of those first, or the conversion of those intersections to the first 5 roundabouts. So the messaging is important, and I think it's consistent in terms of what we're seeing with roundabouts in the U.S. And it's important that we share that information with not only practitioners, probably primarily like we have on this call today, but also with our elected officials and the public. And we make sure that they're aware that what we're investing in at our intersections is really giving us results. We can really talk about the results, and in the case of Connecticut, really they're talking about injuries saved and crashes saved because of the roundabouts in their environment. Jamie, I think we are at a point where we perhaps might address any questions, and I don't see any, but I'm not sure that my screen is up to date.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we do have a few questions, but first I'm going to ask the audience a few. Our first one is, which of the following are risks of rural roadways? High speeds, over 35 miles per hour, speed differentials, isolated intersections, at-grade intersections, two-lane roadways, roadway lighting sparse, all of the above, none of the above, or I don't know, I don't remember. And our second question for you is, which of the following are benefits of rural roundabouts? 90% reduction in fatalities, 76% reduction in injuries, 35% reduction in all crashes, slow speeds for all vehicles, reduced conflict points, all of the above, none of the above, or I don't know, I don't remember. We'll give everyone just a few seconds to go ahead and fill those out. And then Hillary, while we are waiting on those answers to come in, there are a few questions. The first one is, are there any studies to install roundabouts at non-intersection locations? Also, any experience with roundabouts that are not perfect round circles, like oval-shaped or half circles?
Sure, Jamie. So I'll take that first one. I would say it depends. Some folks actually refer to access points. So someone said at non-intersect, I think the question was related to non-intersections. There are roundabouts across the country that are installed at driveways and access points, and we know that that can mean, a variety of things and a diverse amount of situations where you might have a driveway, but not necessarily. Usually, I would say in the U.S., that we have it at some sort of junction, and that junction could be at a driveway, it could be at an intersection. For the most part, that's where we're seeing. We are seeing some roundabouts that are designed, of course, for future expansion, but for the most part, you usually have at least three legs, and those three legs can be made up of, a driveway, some sort of access point, or a roadway. And the second question was related to the shape or the size. The shape, maybe more particularly, yes, there are roundabouts that are oval-shaped. There's roundabouts that are elliptical-shaped. And that really, especially when you've got skewed intersections or offset-type intersections, you really start to see the art of the roundabout design, where it definitely does not have to be circular. It does not need to be circular. But the point is that you're trying to achieve the slow speeds, the reduction in conflict points, good deflection, and that you try to maintain consistent speeds for all movements. And if you're able to achieve that with an elliptical design, and I don't want to say oval, but some folks might consider that. And the reason I say that is because you don't want to get some of the sides too long, because you don't want to see that increase in speeds. We're trying to make sure that the speeds are between 15 and 25 miles per hour. Hopefully I addressed both of those questions, Jamie.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Hillary. And we do have several other questions for you, but first I'm going to end these polls so that you can see the responses and address those. Are you able to see them?
And I can see them now, Jamie, so hopefully,
okay, perfect.
Hopefully you can get the control back on this. So with the first question, which of the following are risks of rural roadways? The majority of you were spot on. And those of you that actually checked the other ones, you're not incorrect. We were just actually looking for all of those. Again, so all of the above, the high speeds, speed differentials, isolation of intersections, at-grade intersections, two-lane roadways, and sparse lighting and visibility can come in there. The second question was, which of the following are benefits of rural roundabouts? And again, a large majority of you also got that. And again, for those of you that checked the other boxes, you're not incorrect. It's just there's a few other things that we were looking for with that particular question. So great. I hopefully for many of you that's not new information, but for those of you that it is new to, please, this is great information that you can share as you're considering and vetting projects in the rural environment. So Jamie, I'll let you know what direction we want to go next in terms of questions or getting back to the slides.
Sure. So we do have a few more, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you a few more of these questions. The next one is, please advise on the speed threshold generally defining high-speed roundabout locations.
Okay. So again, I think it could be, depending on where you are, I consider, originally when I did some of the research back 15 years ago, I I was looking at greater than 40 miles per hour posted on the approaches. But I think over the years, at least in some of the work that we've done at Federal Highways, we've really kind of looked at, what is that definition of high speed? And what you might see in the Green Book might be different than what others might be using. But, where the risks become higher, where it's harder to slow down, just sheer physics make it more difficult to get that vehicle going from a higher speed to a lower speed. And again, we do have rural roundabouts that have 35 mile an hour, 40, 50, up to at least 65 mile an hour approaches coming into intersections. Now, again, prior to the roundabout being there, these posted speed limits would still be the same. Now, I don't know about you all, but from my experience in driving and traveling across the country, just because this posted speed might say 50 miles an hour doesn't mean you don't have someone going faster. So we do need to think about the operating speed as well.
Perfect. Your next question is, do you have any typical construction costs?
So that's a tough one, and I know my colleague on the phone, Jeff Shaw, has done some work in this area, and again, not just specifically looking at in the rural environment, but looking across the board. It can be a challenge to break it down. So, for example, there's projects that, in a rural environment, you need to take it into context. What does it look like today, and what features are the critical features that you need to make sure it's a safe environment, right? So we're installing the roundabout, we're constructing the roundabout because we feel it's a safe countermeasure, and we feel it's a safe strategy to reduce fatal and injury crashes. So we have to be careful not to get too carried away with the type of materials that we use, with the length of curbing, and I'm going to get a little bit more into that. But directly to your question related to cost, we still see roundabouts ranging anywhere from $300,000 to $3 and $4 million for one roundabout. Now, again, if you've got a utility relocate, or if you have a significant amount of right-of-way, or there's some other element that's into the project, we really do have to be very conscious of how, before we throw out numbers of how much particular projects cost, because sometimes there's additional features and work that is done that may not be related to the roundabout itself. So, and Jeff, I don't know if you want to put in the chat pod any of the numbers that you've been looking at. I will ask maybe that you can consider putting that in the chat pod.
Another question for you, Hillary. The previous one that was asked about non-intersection locations, the question, they did put in some more information. They were meaning mid-block, whether or not those are put in for the purpose of speed control versus access control. Do you have any examples of that?
I actually I can't think of any. It doesn't mean there aren't any there where you've actually used roundabouts mid-block where there's not, again, an access point. I think other features like bump outs, raised crosswalks, some sort of traffic calming median feature, narrowing the lanes, those are probably things that are more often or more common used at mid-block type situations where you don't have, actually have another vehicular access point.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, then we'll move on and we'll address the rest of these at the next section. Another one is, are there unbalanced flows still a concern? And if so, is there a max recommended difference in ADT between major and minor roads?
Okay. So, I think that there's so many good examples out there where we do have very unbalanced flows in rural environments, and but we have a safety problem. And I think we have to ask ourselves, even though there is an unbalanced flow, so particularly let's even say you've got 10,000 on main line or the state highway, and the intersecting road is perhaps, let's say 500 ADT. I'm talking ADT, so 500 and 10,000. But you have a crash history, or you have a lot of near misses, and it is bubbled up on the radar of being an unsafe intersection. We need to really think about what it means to delay, if I can use that word, delaying that mainline traffic or the through traffic that might currently be a two-way stop control, and is delaying that traffic, and most of the delay, of course, in this case is going to be geometric delay from the design of the roundabout itself. Is that 4 or 5 seconds at the end of the day delay for that mainline traffic really an issue if you are identifying or if you have a safety problem or it could be a safety problem? And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. I've gone through this exercise with several agencies where we actually did, estimate, it's actually with the project in particular was probably about 1,000 cars on the minor road and about 20,000 cars on the state highway. And yes, we estimated that there would probably be about a 4 to 5 second delay for those vehicles to slow down, navigate through the roundabout, and head on their way. But because there was an inherent safety risk, the agency said that is an important piece, and that's balancing your performance, maybe your operational or mobility performance measure with your safety performance measure. You also need to think about, if you're not only just talking about vehicles, if you're also talking about bicyclists that might be using that facility or crossing that facility, and pedestrians. Again, it's really kind of backing up and looking at all the performance metrics that you're trying to achieve with a particular project. So unbalanced flows doesn't scare me in terms of putting in roundabouts. Washington State has a great example. The Guide Meridian project headed out of Bellingham, Washington, where they actually have a 4-lane facility out there where they've got some unbalanced flows but they had crossover crashes and they had significant severe crashes on that corridor. And the feedback that I've gotten, Dennis Swires from Washington State, is that has been a huge success even with the unbalanced flows and actually some out-of-direction travel that those minor roads had to take.
Okay, perfect. I'm moving you back over to the presentation. And then for everyone else who has put the questions in the chat pod, we will address some of those when we get to the next section. Okay, Hillary, are you able to see the arrows now underneath?
I am. So we'll
Perfect.
hope that this stays. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Okay.
So what I'm going to talk to you now is I'm just going to share some examples. Some of them I'm going to share the safety data with you, and some of them I just really want you to look at the images. I want you to look at the designs, and then towards the end of our webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those features. So please, as you're seeing the images, as you're seeing this information, please put some questions in the chat pod. So this is actually one of the, I call them one of the original rural roundabouts in the United States. It is in Washington. It is northeast of Spokane, Washington. They had a significant crash problem before. So before, it was a two-way stop control intersection. Over a 5.5-year period, they had about 32 total crashes, 20 injury crashes in there, and 1 fatal crash. So they were really looking for a solution. And Washington State was one of our early adopters of not only roundabouts, but rural roundabouts. This would have been their second rural roundabout in the state. And after, they actually have 12 years of crash data, and for the after now, a total of 10 crashes at this location. 5 of those were injury crashes. However, I did have the opportunity to speak with the region folks as well as the state DOT, and most of those were possible injury. So those would have been the injury on the CABCO scale, probably in the injury C, and maybe one in the injury B, which was probably more of an evident injury, but not an incapacitating injury. So just a huge amount of information there in terms of what they were dealing with 15 years ago and what they're seeing, what was consistent from the minute they constructed that roundabout leading into 2018. They really have a forever solution at that location. California, here's a couple of examples on the left. This is actually all of these images are from one particular project. This would be in District 6 of California, so that's the Fresno district in California. Major agriculture farming area, so it was really critical that they got these features in the design accurate and appropriate for the farming equipment that would be going through there, as well as the trucking industry that would be using this particular location. So again, you can see the length of the splitter islands there. You can see that they actually, on the right, that's an image from what they called a roundabout rodeo prior to construction. They actually held a public roundabout rodeo where they did have folks that brought their RVs, folks that brought their tractors, folks that brought their pickup trucks and everything else you can think of, and gave them an opportunity to see what this roundabout was going to look like before they actually went to construction. It also gave the DOT or Caltrans the opportunity to do some fine-tuning as they headed into final design and prior to construction. So again, you can actually find that video online for that particular roundabout rodeo. This is another example from California. Actually, this is on the north shore of Lake Tahoe. Now, some of you might think, well, that's not really rural, but at the end of the day, actually, that Lake Tahoe area and the roadway, the loop that goes around, you come in and out of a very rural context. It is a state highway that goes through an unincorporated area of a county on the north side of Lake Tahoe. This was a 5-lane section, so it went from a 2-lane rural roadway, flared open to a 5-lane section here in Kings Beach, California, and then went back to a 2-lane roadway once you got through. This is actually a state park on the right-hand side of the image, the aerial image there, and that is a state park that sits on the north shore of Lake Tahoe. So they did have tourism. So again, this is a very much a seasonal type area where they've got folks that ski in the winter and folks that come to the lake in the summer. But the roundabouts change that dynamic, and although there are some built-up areas, there's a lot of pedestrian activity, a lot of biking activity. They went from a 5-lane section to basically a 3-lane section. These two roundabouts, one of them is 114 feet in diameter, and the other one is about 110 feet in diameter. Again, on a state route, on a state highway, you have to get the trucks through. You can actually see a truck in the one image there on the left. But this was that transition, or that area where you're going from rural to lane. You're opening up into more of a, not urban, because it is an unincorporated area, but a touristy area, and then headed back out on the other side of town with a 2-lane roadway. So just gives you an example of one, those transitional areas, and two, actually having a very compact designs on a state highway that is carrying a lot of different traffic, tourist traffic, truck traffic, and other peds and bikes in the area. Actually, just not too far away from those two roundabouts, the Kings Beach roundabouts, is a project. It's one of Nevada's first rural roundabouts in the Incline Village area. A 3-way intersection, 3-legged intersection, actually some significant grades in this area. And although you can see some houses in that area, it is a 2-lane roadway. This particular roundabout was designed to actually be a hybrid. It did have a 2nd lane on the approach coming from the left side of the screen. But it has since been retrofitted to a full single-lane roundabout. And another really good example of where they actually did a retrofit and reduced the lanes, because the police, the law enforcement, were saying that drivers actually knew that they got that 2nd lane at the roundabout, and so there would be a lot of passing through the roundabout because it was 2 lanes in each direction. So they went back and they said, from an operational standpoint or from a traffic volume standpoint, we did not need the additional lane. And so they did a really nice retrofit where they actually used marking and some flexible tubes to go to a full single lane at this location. Again, steep grades, some very significant challenges with terrain here, but a success story in terms of not having fatal and injury crashes at this location. Moving over to Montana, I really liked seeing this image that they put together for a particular project, Canyon Ferry Road, just outside east of Helena, Montana, where they again are showing some before and after data. So before it was a 2-way stop controlled, and you can see there 6 years prior to the roundabout going in. I really appreciate the imaging, the creativity that they used with this images. 27 crashes before, 2 of those being fatal, 20 serious injury, 8 minor, and 14 fender benders. And then in the 6 years after, since that roundabout has gone in, they've had 9 total crashes, 0 fatalities, 0 serious injuries, 0 minor injuries, and 9 fender benders. So again, telling that story and making sure that you're able to communicate that message to not only the public, but to elected officials and to other agencies that might be looking or might have a location that might be similar to yours. This is an example of, again, one of the first rural roundabouts in, on the right-hand side of the screen here, the 2 images. One of the first rural roundabouts in the state of Iowa. This is outside of Waterloo, Iowa. So again, major agricultural farming area. Really unique story here. I had the opportunity to be a part of this project when it was going on. And they really engaged the farmers. They engaged the users. They needed to make sure, although this was a safety project, they had some severe crashes here. They really knew that the success of this project overall really depended on the farming equipment that was able to get through and navigate through this intersection. So they changed in terms of the location of some of the signs, the type of curbing that they used in this area, the transition from the shoulder to having curbing on the outside in the intersection area itself was really a critical component to not only, they were confident that they were going to get the safety success, but in order for this project to truly be a success, they knew that they had to make sure that that farming equipment could get through there without any trouble. The images on the left actually also are from Iowa, again, one of their other rural roundabouts, but you can see that there's actually a buggy, a horse and buggy going through this particular roundabout. Again, making sure you're knowing all of your stakeholders in your projects, making sure that they understand, and if there's any features that you can add or not add to help them navigate through the intersection safely, that is an important piece as well. Moving down to Kansas from Iowa, again, these 3 roundabouts here are actually, again, some of the 3 original rural roundabouts in this country. Kansas hit this really, they were very serious about reducing fatal and injury crashes in their rural environments. Now, each of this is 3 different intersections here, Paola, Kansas, Florence, Kansas, and the other one is Garnett, Kansas. These were all truck routes. These all had 65-mile-an-hour posted speeds on at least 2 of the approaches. And they had a significant safety problem at each of these locations. So it was important to them to find a solution that, again, was a forever solution. At each of these locations, they are pretty isolated. There's probably not going to be a significant increase in traffic volume. However, they did have severe crash problems at these locations. So the upper left image, that's actually a 3-legged intersection. The upper right image, that's a 5-legged intersection. And the bottom image is actually also a 5-legged intersection, both U.S. highways, and trucks in the order of, over 50% trucks. Not only over 50% trucks, but a high number of oversized, overweight, over-length trucks. And that image on the bottom right, that's Florence, Kansas. So a little story there, the car on the right-hand side with the flashers, that is my car. I was driving up on this one. Again, I spent a lot of time out here, but I was so excited to see all those big trucks in that roundabout. I pulled over and I ran back down the shoulder so I could try to get a picture of, you actually have 5 trucks in that roundabout. It is 5 legs. It is a 210-foot diameter roundabout. But it just tells you roundabouts can be designed for our large vehicles. We've got, across the country, we've got good examples of good designs and working with our stakeholders to make sure that, 1, they know how to drive it, and 2, that we've got features that help them navigate those intersections. Moving down to Georgia now, this example here, this is actually one of the smallest rural, and this is, again, one of those more or less a transitional area in Georgia. It is about 90 feet in diameter, and you can see the images on the right that actually this one was retrofitted, a stop control intersection retrofitted to a roundabout that was done by Georgia DOT, their own forces. This one actually cost about $70,000 to go from the stop controlled to the actual roundabout. Originally, when it was constructed, it was actually a mini roundabout. However, since then, they have gone and they actually have put some signing in the center island to, again, just have that conspicuity of the drivers as they approach the intersection. This was an all-way stop location, had very, very, very long queues at this particular location that were completely eliminated after the roundabout was put in. Again, kind of the fringe area, kind of the rural area that people are using to get into the urban areas, but it does have some of those rural characteristics that we see from the other examples. South Carolina, again, we've got some good before and after data at this particular location. This is near Orangeburg, South Carolina, one of their early rural roundabouts. In the 3 years before the roundabout was put in, they had 17 total crashes and 12 injury crashes. And I recently got an update from South Carolina DOT. In 5 years after the roundabout was installed, constructed, 13 total crashes, 0 injury crashes. So time after time, we're seeing these great benefits afterwards. This is a location you can actually see it is a skewed intersection in the upper right image. They did need to have some additional features. They do have quite a bit of truck traffic going through there. You can see the lowboy on the bottom left headed over the roundabout, actually riding on the truck apron. There's outside blister that you can see in the red there as well. So because of the skewed nature and because of them trying to minimize right-of-way and impacts to those properties on each of the quadrants, that they utilized an outside blister or an outside truck apron to make sure that the trucks could maneuver through this particular intersection in all directions. So another great example in terms of kind of looking at some of the features, but also a great story in terms of the reduction in injury crashes. Here's some examples from Maryland. You can see here again, Maryland again was one of the very early adopters of roundabouts and early adopters of roundabouts in rural environments. Even again, mentioning that the rural environment that you do have larger traffic volumes, you've got folks that are commuting from more of a rural environment into more of the urban areas. So again, a lot of lessons to learn from the early days of what Maryland did with their projects. The bottom right, that also is a truck route. They actually did add some additional signing at that particular location because originally when they built it, the trucks actually were not using the truck apron. So they added a sign to help orient the trucking industry in terms of it's okay to use that truck apron. It's actually designed for you. And that's where our education comes in, is really maybe getting ahead of that and working with potential the trucking industry or the freight industry within your state as you're looking at implementing and constructing roundabouts in the network. A few more examples here, and then we'll take another break and ask a few questions. So the examples here on the left actually are from the Lummi Nation, and that's in Washington State. This particular project was also a safety project. The Lummi Nation has done great things for safety, not only with implementing roundabouts, but they've got some great pedestrian and pathway projects that they have worked on. Again, just gives you a sense. This one is one of the more of an oval or an elliptical shape. Again, very skewed intersection. And this one drives very well, again, 15, 20 miles an hour as you're navigating through that particular intersection on the left. And on the right, we have some examples from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. Gives you, actually, it's two different. The ground view there is headed into one roundabout that is a part of the Oneida Nation. And then on the bottom, that also, it is a state highway. The Oneida Nation actually integrated one of their symbols features is the turtle. Actually, so the center island from the area, you can actually see the turtle, and actually you can see it not only from the aerial view, but you can actually see it as you navigate the intersection itself. The bottom right image is also an oversized, overweight route where they actually had to modify both the outside curbing as well as the truck apron to make sure they could get the extra long vehicles through this particular intersection. So it's a real nice example of modifying the truck apron and the outside curbing to account for, in this case, it was the east and the west movements of long vehicles. So this is outside, several miles outside of the Green Bay area, again, with some enhancements and features highlighting the United Nations. We also have our federal lands projects, and so although some of these projects in national parks and U.S. Forest Service property may not be high speed, they are absolutely certainly in a rural environment. So we've got examples from Denali National Park. Arches National Park is the bottom two images. That actually just was constructed last year. And then Golden Gate National Park, which is a significant biking area outside of and north of the San Francisco Bay area, where you've got, again, a three-legged roundabout with very steep grades and a lot of road bikers that practice up and down the hills there north of San Francisco. So that just gives you a taste of some of the projects and opportunities that we have, in whether it's state parks or a city park or U.S. Forest Service property, Bureau of Land Management, or national parks. This particular project is ongoing right now. This is in Grand Teton National Park. This actually is a state highway that goes through Grand Teton National Park, headed out of Jackson, Wyoming, and towards Yellowstone National Park. This one is currently under construction right now. A significant amount of bicyclists that navigate through the pathways in Grand Teton National Park, so that was a big element of the design for this particular project. I had the privilege of actually being out there with the park earlier this week, so these pictures are actually just from yesterday. And they are in the process of getting that hopefully buttoned up by October, so there will be a roundabout again. So this is not only in a national park where we've got a lot of tourists, we've got a lot of bicyclists, we've got a lot of activity, but it also is a high-speed facility. The main line is a high-speed facility, and this is another example of unbalanced flows between the side roads there and the state highway, the main line road. And with that, I think, Jamie, I'll turn it back over to you so we can facilitate some Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Hillary. For everyone on the line, we do have one more poll question for you. True or false, there are no examples of rural roundabouts on tribal or federal lands? And so, Hillary, while we are waiting for those answers to come in, your next question is, what is the best measure of performance VC, delay, or queuing length when considering 20-year planning horizon?
Okay, so I'm going to, what is the best measure? I see it here on the screen. A VC, delay, queuing length when considering 20-year planning horizon. Well, you know, I think that I'm glad you didn't put level of service, so I'll just share that. I think it's important to look at, you know, queuing becomes really critical, particularly if you've got other driveways. So, for example, if you have other driveways, you need to take that into consideration. Delay, that is obviously that is one of our, you know, cornerstone performance measures when we're looking at operations. I think it's important to look at. I think one of the most important things when we're looking at the operational and we look at the 20-year planning horizon is we tend to focus on the peak hour. And I'd really like to encourage people to think about all the other hours of the day with those performance measures. What's the queue length, you know, at 3 p.m.? What's the queue length at 6 p.m.? What's the queue length on Saturday or on Sunday? And we know that resources are scarce. We know that operations is important, safety is important, and we oftentimes are trying to balance those competing needs. So I've always encouraging folks to not only look at off-peak hour, but also in terms of the 20-year planning horizon that you mentioned, also look at the 10-year and the 15-year horizon. We've got several states now that are have in their design guidance that they are considering the 10-year and the 15-year horizon in terms of traffic volume, in terms of what they ultimately construct, because of the accuracy of some of our traffic projections. So in some areas, we might be really darn confident in terms of what our construction year traffic volumes are going to be, what that's going to look like in 10 years and maybe even in 20 years. But quite honestly, for the most part, oftentimes, we are using models. We are using assumptions. We are using estimates to get to that 20-year. What happens if we're off 5%, 10%? And so the sensitivity analysis becomes an important piece of that as well. So I like to encourage people to dig deeper. Dig deeper in terms of not just looking at peak hour, dig deeper in terms of not just focusing on 20-year and looking at one number. Do a little sensitivity analysis. Do some what-if scenarios with your planning and with your projecting to make sure that you've got a project that's not over-designed. And takes things into consideration.
Hillary, at this time I have closed the poll and
Okay.
broadcast those results if you want to go back to that.
Sure. So again, the question was, there are no examples of rural roundabouts in tribal and federal land. So the good news is I'm going to say all of you got that right. I'm hoping that someone was teasing me with the true there, but we absolutely have some excellent examples in the United States of roundabouts, not only rural, but roundabouts in general on tribal lands as well as on federal lands. Again, those are really some great opportunities that we can be working with our partners to explore whether or not roundabouts might be a viable alternative. And I'll just share one more thing with you. In terms of the national park system, we do now have roundabouts in Denali. There's a roundabout in Yosemite, roundabout in Arches National Park, a roundabout, obviously I just mentioned the Grand Teton National Park, and there's several other parks that are actually looking at roundabouts. So that's a great opportunity in terms of really putting a solution in that can be that forever solution in our beautiful parks and recreational areas.
We do have quite a few questions, so I'll read a few more to you, and then we'll move on and answer the rest of them at the next section. But the next one for you is, would you consider a roundabout at an intersection that does not meet a signal warrant?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one of the things that's probably unique to roundabouts, is there are not warrants for roundabouts for the most part. From a national perspective, the Transportation Research Board, Federal Highways, we have not pursued, it's been brought up, but no one has pursued warrants for roundabouts. Roundabouts can work at 50 cars a day, and roundabouts can work at 60,000 cars a day. It all is in how you design it and how many lanes you put in and the pedestrian features and the bike features. So absolutely, we have, I think I'm going to venture to say a couple of thousand roundabouts are at locations where we do not meet signal warrants.
The next question for you is, should lighting be required for rural roundabouts?
So that's an interesting question. I just say that because we do have some locations that don't have lighting, and we also have a significant difference in how agencies do light roundabouts. We have some that have policies related to, I'm going to get a little bit more into lighting actually in the next section. So Minnesota has a policy on lighting roundabouts, and Colorado has a policy on lighting roundabouts. But take a state like South Carolina, where they don't light any intersections. And so they really struggled with, when they first were implementing roundabouts, where, wow, no matter what we have out here, we wouldn't have put a signal, or we wouldn't have put lighting in, and now, we think we should put lighting in. And so does that mean 8 lights? Does it mean 4 lights? Does it mean 16 lights? Does it mean 1 light? So this is an area that I really see is still emerging in terms of, is there a sweet spot in terms of how we look at lighting? I also like to think of it as visibility. So let's think about all of the features that contribute to the visibility of an intersection or a roundabout. And that has to do with good signing. Sometimes it has to do with good marking. It could be raised pavement markers. It could be perhaps doing some uplighting in locations. So the specific question, and I can't see it anymore, I don't think, is should lighting be required? And I think that that is an agency decision, because I think currently outside of roundabouts and decisions that are made at stop-controlled intersections and signalized intersections in rural environments, that is really an agency decision. And in some cases, some might say it's a risk manager, talking with your risk manager in terms of what are we doing at non-roundabout intersections and what are we going to do with roundabout intersections. So I would love for that to be a conversation at the agency level.
Your next question is, with respect to roundabouts in or near rural communities with a highway as their main street, what is your experience or opinion on the use of more radial approaches versus those designs U.S. domestic guidance recommends?
So again, one of the great benefits, in my opinion, on roundabouts is that, and if you read the foreword of the current NCHRP 672, which is the Roundabout Informational Guide, it really is, it's a guide. There's very few things from a national perspective, and really for most states, that are you have to do this or you have to do that. It's more you're taking your project into context. And this is where the art meets the engineering. Sometimes it's very rare that you might have what we call the offset right, but there are instances where that actually might work on a project. The radial designs were very, I would say, early on. They were way more popular than they are now. You see more offset left. You see more offset left designs. But I think it's absolutely important to design a roundabout that fits the context of your project, as long as you're achieving those fundamental principles, which is low speeds, between 15 and 25 miles per hour, good deflection, and good driver expectations headed into that. And also from the multimodal perspective, what does that look like for a bike versus a truck versus a car versus a bus versus a vehicle? So I think there's nothing that's off the table. You just need to make sure that whatever your alignment is, that you're achieving those goals of low speed, reduced speed differential, and a good understanding and awareness of the driver going from the approach into the circulatory roadway.
One more question for you, and then we'll move on, and that is, what are some ideas to reduce maintenance in Center RA islands?
So there's a lot of rural roundabouts that basically have nothing in the center island. Basically, it's dirt mounded, okay, because we're going to talk a little bit about conspicuity as the driver's approaching the roundabout. So it might be dirt, it might be a native grass, it might be weeds, depending on where you are. Because more often than not in a rural environment, you probably don't have irrigation system, you probably don't have the resources to have someone to go out and water and get vegetation to get established. So that's one way of looking at it. And maybe I've had the opportunity to work with some of our international partners in France and in UK. And in some of their rural environments, they do some sort of feature in the center island that's just more somehow highlights their community. So for example, in the fishing area in France, they might have actually an old boat that just sits in the middle. So it has some aesthetic value, it has some art, but you're not really having to maintain anything. So it had some doming, and it had a boat that was representative of their fishing community. So you can be as boring as you want or as creative as you want. I think most agencies don't have the resources to do a lot of maintenance. There are some agencies that will work with a more local, maybe a local agency or a local volunteer group that might adopt the center island, so to speak, where they might add some features into the center island. But it's not required that you do a bunch of fancy anything in a center island, as long as the drivers, the drivers, again, don't need to see straight through the roundabout. That's another thing that we'll talk about in a minute. And you're obviously going to be having, usually you're going to have a directional arrow and or a one-way sign as well in that center island.
And just to give Hillary a couple minutes to breathe here, we do have some other comments that I'll read out to you guys from the chat pod. Norman Hope mentioned that they have a couple of roundabouts that have zero scape with mounding of various rock and stone materials in the center. And then we also have Hillary's colleague, Jeff Shaw, who said on the cost question that came up earlier, he thinks that the range Hillary stated, the $300,000 to $2 million, captures well the experience for rural single-lane roundabouts. And then another comment from Jeff is that the key to cost effectiveness is remembering that roundabout designs can be very adaptable to local conditions. They don't have to be perfectly round, nor does the circle need to be spot-on centered on the existing intersection center lines. The circle can be moved around to avoid major costly impacts. Also, it's predictable that agencies will want to over-design to be conservative, but it's ultimately not necessarily and can actually be worse and drive up the costs. So those are just a few questions, or comments rather, that were in the chat pod as well. We are going to move on to the next section to make sure that Hillary has plenty of time to finish up, and then we'll come back to the questions afterwards. Hillary?
Thanks, Jamie. So we're going to wrap up today's webinar just talking about some of the features of rural roundabouts, and then again we'll have some time here at the end to go to the questions. So you do see, again, a wide variety of different types of designs, and again that's why I think roundabouts are great, because it can bring the creativity out in us as well as the engineering part of our projects. So I'll talk a little bit about approach geometry, and then I mentioned this earlier when the lighting question came up, but the visibility and conspicuity. So the signing, the curbing, the lighting, in addition to the approach geometry and how we communicate to drivers. Okay, so in the rural environment, how are we communicating to drivers when there's a two-way stop, when there's a four-way stop, when there's a signal in a rural environment, or when there's a roundabout? And making sure that we are balanced in how we look at what we might do for one alternative to the next. So I still do get questions, and I'm sure many of you do as well. How do drivers slow down to navigate that rural roundabout? When people are unfamiliar, or perhaps there's not a roundabout in a rural environment, or even a roundabout, any type of roundabout in an area, some folks have to adjust, and they have to understand, what does that really mean? Well, to be honest, we are asking, in rural environments, we are asking drivers to navigate curves and right angles and all sorts of things already. I've got a couple of images there. You can see on the top image, that's you've got chevrons to go around a curve. And in the bottom image, you actually have the turn. It's not even the squiggle curve. It's actually the turn sign, the warning sign, with the advisory speed plate. So drivers should be familiar with some of these things that already are out there in the rural environment. And even take that to whether it's an urban environment or a rural environment. If you've got an interchange or a loop, think of a loop ramp as you go from one facility to the other. And we've got the chevrons, and we have the advisory speed plate. Those are things that drivers should be familiar with already. And what we're doing with the roundabout is very similar. We have a circular intersection. We need to communicate to the driver that we have a circular intersection and make sure that they are able to navigate that safely, that they can adjust their speed, because that's really what we're asking in all of these other environments, and now we're doing it at a roundabout. The data there, the figure, actually just shows, it comes from some of the work that I did with rural roundabouts, where I actually did a speed study looking at roundabouts with rumble strips on the approaches, and we'll talk about that in a minute, roundabouts without rumble strips on the approaches, and then compared that to the speeds that I saw at, or collected, the data that I collected on the approaches to two-way stop control, so the stop on the two-way stop control intersections in rural environments. And really what that is telling us, and this is about 100 feet from the yield line or the stop bar in the case of the two-way stop control intersection, is that you actually get better speed control and speed reduction with the roundabout than you actually do with the stop control or the stop of the two-way stop control intersection. And so the yellow there is the two-way stop control intersection, and that's the speeds at 100 feet from the stop bar or from the yield line. And then it's just a count in terms of the number of drivers that were going that particular speed. So that's what's on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is the speed that those drivers are going. So again, you can see that the transverse rumble strips on the approaches, and this was isolated to the Kansas roundabouts that I had collected data at, you actually do get a slower speed coming into the roundabout with transverse rumble strips. Now that is a policy more or less that Kansas has for isolated intersections, not just necessarily for roundabouts, but also for stop controlled. So that's why we saw that in Kansas. And then the blue is actually showing other roundabouts that did not have transverse rumble strips. But again, you can see the blue bell curve there in terms of the speeds that drivers were going. And so you've got an average with the rumble strips probably at about 20 miles per hour. You've got an average with the roundabouts without rumble strips at about 25 miles per hour, 100 feet in advance of the stop line or yield line. And then with the two-way stop control location, it was about 30 miles per hour, so about 5 miles per hour more than with the roundabout, 5 miles per hour more with the stop condition versus the yield condition at the roundabout. So that's just, to me, that was really interesting, that the advance warning sign that we give, the advance warning that we give the drivers in advance of a rural roundabout, and it's a combination of curbing, splitter island, signing, and in the case of Kansas, it's also a rumble strip. And in the cases of this study, they did all have roadway lighting at them. It really was influencing how the drivers were navigating, and then their speeds up until that yield line, or in the case of the roundabout. So that's really important. We're really not asking folks to do anything that we haven't. And the data shows that we actually, in advance of rural roundabouts, we're actually getting lower speeds, 100 feet, that critical decision point that drivers have. We're getting lower speeds at that critical decision point in advance of them stopping. So in NCHRP 672, you see a couple of options on how approach geometry might look. One comes primarily from the UK, and that's what you see in the upper left. Many of the early designs in Kansas, Minnesota, and even Wisconsin looked a little bit more like this, where you really just more or less have a taper, and then you've got the deflection on entry with that nice curvature as you are very close to the circulating roadway. The Australian type design also, that basically is more of a reverse curve that you see on the approach, which also, again, we borrowed that from in our guidance here in the U.S. from Australia, which some agencies are using more of the reverse curve design. And then I would say we're to a point now in the U.S. where many agencies have some sort of a blended approach. It's not a full, maybe what I would call a reverse curve, but you definitely do see some, a change in the alignment or some curvature on the approach. The image on the bottom right actually comes from the Wisconsin DOT, the Wisconsin Facilities Development Manual, where again, it provides guidance on how you would design that splitter island. And we're going to talk, I want to talk a little bit also about the splitter island length. In NCHRP 672, it says right there on the image that you're looking at, 200 feet or more desirable, 100-foot minimum in a rural environment. So this is specific to, if you look in NCHRP 672, it's specific to the rural environment. And all of the data that I have shared with you on before and after crash data, I think almost all of those have had splitter islands that have been basically, I'm going to say 250 feet or less, okay? So our crash data, and whether it is a more of a radial type design or more of the design that you see there on the screen on the left, or it's a reverse curve, the results are the same. The safety results are the same. And I think what we have to ask ourselves ultimately when we're designing is, how are we communicating to the drivers? Do you have room to put a full reverse curve in on all of your approaches? Or would that maybe prohibit you from designing the roundabout or constructing the roundabout in the first place? So that's that flexibility that we have as designers. And I think the most important thing is that the safety results, at least from what I've been able to collect here in the United States and what is consistent with our international partners, is the results are the same in terms of the reduction in fatal and injury crashes. Here's just some examples here. In this case, this is actually an image that I showed earlier. This is on a Wisconsin State Highway with the Oneida Nation. And that's showing, you can see the dimension. I dimensioned it out in Google Earth. And Jamie, you're going to have to forgive me because it's not blown up on my screen. I believe it was 227 feet. So the upper left image, that splitter island, again, this is a truck route. It's a state highway. It was 227 feet. The image from Kansas, this is again one that I've shared previously with some of the images. This is the 5-leg. It's 210 feet in diameter. It has a 180-foot splitter island length. Notice they're all different. They're all a little different in terms of the splitter island lengths. In the case of the Kansas project, that one, the approach that I measured there, the 180 feet, that is one of the 65-mile-an-hour approaches, okay? And you can see that there's not a reverse curve on this one. This was an earlier design. It was done in the 90s, whereas the Wisconsin design is a little bit more recent. It doesn't necessarily have a reverse curve on it, but you can see that there is an attempt to have, again, to have good deflection and have good speed control, and as well as awareness of the driver as they approach that intersection. Let's talk a little bit about, again, that visibility and conspicuity. And that is a combination of that splitter island length that we just talked about, the introduction of the splitter island, the center island, which I'm showing the images on the right, how you're doming or creating that visual for the driver as they approach the intersection. The geometry, which ties to the splitter island as well as the alignment. The curbing, how you're introducing the curbing on the splitter island as well as on the outside. And then opportunities for lighting. And then, of course, our signing. So this is all information that we're providing the driver as they're approaching a roundabout. And I think it's safe to say that all of the roundabouts that I have seen in this country, we have more signing and more visual cues for the driver in advance of roundabouts than we do for any two-way stop, all-way stop, or signalized isolated intersection. We are giving more information to the driver in advance of the roundabout already with all of this information. And whether it is a roundabout ahead sign with an advisory speed plate, you have the option of having the yield ahead sign. Oftentimes there's some sort of route marker sign that is in advance as well, like we would see with any other type of intersection. Some agencies are using the larger green diagrammatic signs. But we are providing drivers with more information in advance of roundabouts than we are of any other intersection. Just a reminder that the yield sign is actually the only shall in the MUTCD for roundabouts. I'm not saying that because I think it's the only sign. I absolutely think that we should use other signs as we're looking, particularly at rural roundabouts. Many agencies do use the directional arrow, which is on the bottom. Some agencies supplement that directional arrow with the one-way sign. Connecticut, for example, I know they do prefer to always have the one-way sign for all of their roundabouts in addition to the directional arrows. We also have the option of, again, having the roundabout ahead sign with the advisory speed plate. I will note that that there is guidance if an approach to a roundabout has a statutory or posted speed of 40 miles per hour or higher, that the circular intersection symbol sign should be installed in advance. So again, it's a should. It's not a shall, but I really do like to always see a roundabout ahead sign and always see an advisory speed plate. That is my practice. I guess if I can use those terms. I think it is good information to the driver, just like we do, I showed those examples earlier, not at roundabouts, in advance of a curve on a rural roadway, where we use warning signs and advisory speed plates to inform the driver about the geometry ahead. Again, just some examples of some of the things that we see, and I know we're getting towards the end here. We are at the end of our time. But just other examples, in California, for example, they do use a flashing beacon with their advanced warning sign. They also do this for isolated signals. So again, they're translating what they do for signals to roundabouts. And that's the bottom left picture where you see there's a flashing beacon in advance of the roundabout, the rural roundabout. Some of the other features in South Carolina, they double up their signs, and they do this not only at roundabouts, they do it at stop control intersections as well, where they double up the advanced warning signs in rural locations. And then I mentioned Kansas. Kansas does use transverse rumble strips about 1,000 feet in advance of the intersection. Curbing is important. Again, if you know you've got oversized, overweight vehicles or farming vehicles, you do need to have the conversation about mountable curb versus vertical curb, whether you're in a northern climate and you need to plow, or you have some other type of vehicle that you want to make sure. It is also important in a rural environment, just as it is in an urban environment. And then lighting. We've got some images here. Lighting can be very helpful. It can be done a lot of different ways. I think the most common lighting we do have is on the perimeter lighting. We don't see as much of the lighting, the central illumination. Early on, we tend to see that, but we did notice that we have areas with pedestrians that it was a little bit more challenging to see the crosswalks with this center illuminated lighting. And again, just some images at night. Examples, that one on the upper picture is actually obviously around the holidays, but you can see some of the lighting in the headlights and how that directional arrow really stands out as you approach the intersection. And I think we're at the end, Jamie, so if you want to, I think there's one more poll question, and then if people want to stay on for a little more Q&A, I'm happy to do that, but I defer to you in terms of how we move forward here.
Perfect. I do want to make sure that you can go through these resources that are available, so let's do that. And then we do have, so that you're aware, there's about 12 questions still queued up in the chat pod.
Okay.
So what I'd like to suggest is if you're unavailable to stay, or if maybe our audience is, if I can put those into a Word document and have you and Jeff respond to those, and we can send those to everyone who's registered along with the ones you've already answered, and also post those with the archived version of this if that's something you guys are willing to do.
Absolutely. I can stay on, and we can do both. So whatever works for you, Jamie.
Perfect. So if you'd like to talk about your resources first,
Sure.
just in case someone does have to jump off.
Yep, I mentioned really early on NCHRP 1770, which is the development of roundabout crash prediction models. So that's great news that we're going to update not only rural roundabout crash prediction models, but really took a deeper dive in terms of roundabouts and looking at the crash prediction model. So that should be out shortly. It is planned that that will go into the update to the Highway Safety Manual. I also just wanted to point out, for those of you who aren't aware, TRB works in cooperation with Teach America to record and to post and archive all of our International Roundabout Conference materials, presentations, papers. And so if you're not familiar with that site, we actually date back all the way to 2005 when we actually had the Roundabout Conference in Colorado. It was then in Kansas City, Carmel, Indiana, Seattle, and then most recently in Green Bay, Wisconsin. But a lot of great resources out there for you all, and even some good case studies of other rural roundabouts and other features that people have used. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then the last slide is a little bit more focused. It actually just has a couple of the brochures that Federal Highways has. If you're interested in any of those brochures, you think they would help you as you navigate consideration of a rural roundabout, please let us know. We can get you copies of that, or you can download a PDF. And then I did actually the 3 papers that I was involved with on rural high-speed. Again, it's mainly those first 17 that I showed you up front. There are some papers about the speed effects, the statistical models, the early ones. Of course, now I just told you there's going to be another, and then just some of the before and after data. So just data. What was it like before? What was it like after, for those of you that may not be familiar with some of those resources? And that's all I have, Jamie.
Perfect, thank you. So I am going to leave us on this slide right here, which is Hillary's contact information. We will address just a few more of the questions in the chat pod, but if you do have any additional ones, please go ahead and put those in. As soon as we are done recording today's webinar, I will take all of those questions, and we will create a question and answer document for you guys and have Hillary and Jeff go ahead and answer all of the remaining ones that did not get answered in this recording. We will post it with the archived version of this available on the Safety Center website, and we will also email it out to everyone who registered for today's webinar. Again, I do want to apologize as well. I know that we had some issues with the rooms again. We did think that this was taken care of in June. We upped our limit to 500, and as you can see, there's about 150 of you only allowed in today. So we do apologize for that. Adobe Connect, there obviously is something going on there, and we do have a meeting scheduled for directly following this. We thank you for those of you who joined us only by the phone because you weren't able to get in to see the visuals. We will post this archive as soon as possible. You know, generally it takes us about a week, but we will get that done as soon as we are able to and get that emailed out to everybody, along with all of these question and answers, as there has been a great amount of discussion today. So the next question for all of you who are able to stay on for a little bit longer was, why do you believe roundabouts are not chosen more often, especially in the U.S.? We did have Jeff put in a answer to this in the chat pod, so I will read that off first. He said, I think it's still the uphill climb that it takes to persuade a community to trust that a roundabout will be better. The evidence to support roundabouts is tremendous, and yet opposition is quite common. It can take a lot of effort to address the loudest voices shouting down a proposed roundabout. However, it's a worthwhile effort, and it will get easier with each successful one built. And Hillary, did you have any other thoughts on that question as well?
I think Jeff did an excellent job answering it.
Okay, perfect. Try and find the next question for you. The next question is there any problem for liquid tankers for back-to-back curve at the approach of the roundabouts?
Okay, so this question related to the liquid tankers. So I think we could also ask ourselves the question in terms of the not only the geometrics with back-to-back approach curves, but also the curbing. If a tanker or anything that has anything liquid, that there could be some load shift. And even, to be honest, take that a whole another level. It's consider like a cattle truck or someone hauling horses, something to that effect, where load shift really is an issue to be thinking about. We want to consider that, and that's why I encourage everyone to be very thoughtful in that approach geometry, because it is possible. You know, motorcycles is another question that we get that's similar to that. Well, what does the approach geometry do to a motorcyclist? We don't have, I can't say that we have evidence that the reverse curves cause problems by any means for those users, But I think it's worth the conversation, and the question is if we know that minimal reverse curves or no reverse curves get us the same results, I think we should ask ourselves that question. Is there added value to having some sort of reverse curve on the approach or not? In terms of what I brought up with the truck apron, it's important that we have a nice gradual transition between the circulatory roadway and the truck apron if we think we're going to have, whether, again, someone that has liquid or someone that might have cattle or horses or something in their trailer. We don't want load shift whatsoever. So that transition, and really if you go to the guidance in NCHRP 672, it talks about the 2 to 3 inches. We know that a 3-inch vertical can cause some load shift based on some research that Federal Highways has done. It's simulation. It was not real life data, but it was a simulation that we did with a 3-inch vertical. Jeff, I don't know if you're still on the call, but maybe you could post the TOPR 34, the truck evaluation link on there where you can take a look at that. But that's specific to the curbing. That's not specific to your question on the reverse curve. I think it's just thinking about it, being thoughtful about it, and also knowing the facts about how the different types of designs perform, both from primarily from a safety perspective.
We'll do one more question, Hillary, and then the rest of these, as I mentioned before, I will get to you in writing so that you guys can address those and we can send them out later. The last question is, are there any studies regarding compliance rates regarding mountable aprons? And would you advise using stop signs on the minor legs depending on the circumstances?
Okay. So I'm going to take the second question first. So stop signs are not a part of roundabouts. Roundabouts are only controlled by yield signs. So if you ever see a stop sign at a circular intersection, typically it's because it might be a traffic circle and not a modern roundabout. So the beauty of the modern roundabout is really it is the driver that makes that decision on whether or not they have a gap, they are able to get in or not. So the stop sign really isn't an option at a true modern roundabout. It is a feature that you do see on circular intersections. The second question, any studies regarding compliance rates regarding mountable curbs? So actually, no, not that I'm aware of, first, but you don't have, I guess I'm not 100% sure how the question has been posed here. Compliance in terms of folks using the mountable aprons, if that's the question, the mountable aprons, the aprons are for the trucks, that they're designed for the back end of a large vehicle to go through. And most situations, we do have drivers utilizing them because you are able to keep a more compact design if you do utilize that truck apron. And so the truck apron is, whether it's in the circulatory roadway or a true truck apron, or it's an outside mountable apron that you have maybe at a skewed intersection, more often than not, the agencies that are putting in roundabouts are trying to communicate that message, again, to the users that might need that mountable. So it could be the freight industry. It could be maybe there's a farmer in terms of them having truck drivers come in. So there isn't always, there is an education component to what we do as designers, as engineers, as planners. We always need to be communicating with the users, because if they don't know they're supposed to use the mountable apron, then shame on us. We should have communicated that a little bit better. And I see a lot of good examples out there where agencies are doing their homework and they are reaching out and they are doing the education. And I think we just need to make sure that each agency take that into account, particularly if they don't have roundabouts already and they are looking to roundabouts for the first time in their communities.
And after that, we will wrap up. Thank you to everyone who has stayed a little bit longer just to listen to the answers to those questions. And thank you so much to both Hillary and Jeff for taking the time to present and to answer those questions, provide the links through the chat pod. We do really appreciate it, Hillary. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks. We'll see everyone in August.